Alf and I, to sharing this discussion on learning by abduction. You know, theory building is very important to all of us as young scholars, as old scholars, but also as practitioners. We need theory in order to make sense of the world. We need theory in order to be able to learn and pass on what we know. We need theory in order to understand buzzing, blooming, confusing subjects in a reasonable way. And so we need to think about theory building as really consisting of 3 steps. First is the conception of a hunch, an idea, a half-baked idea by abduction. Second, once you have selected a hunch, then it's a matter of constructing the theory by deduction, using good philosophy of logic. And then once that is designed, to move on to justify a theory and test it by argumentation and induction. These 3 steps, of course, are highly interrelated and oftentimes happen simultaneously and not necessarily in this direction. But what is important to recognize, though, is that this first idea of conceiving a theory by abduction is often confused with induction. And so let's clarify what we mean by deduction, induction, and abduction. By deduction, we mean basically moving from general theoretical principles to specific instances. It's descending the ladder of abstraction, using logistic reasoning, where if the major and the minor premises both are true, then the conclusion must be true. That is logic, validity as a criterion. Induction works in the reverse. It is ascending the ladder of abstraction, if you will, moving from specific instances to general principles. It uses quantitative or qualitative data as the specific instances to find probabilistic generalities. Empirical truth is the criterion often used. And of course, truth in a philosophical sense is quite different from validity. Logic focuses on validity. Empiricism focuses on truth. But abduction is quite different. It's moving from some unexplained anomaly, a surprise, some funny thing happened, toward a plausible explanation. It's a generative process of creating and evaluating explanations that would render the anomaly understandable. And plausibility is the criterion, because you see, abduction occurs right up front when the initial surprise is achieved. So with this as an introduction, are there comments about clarifying what we mean when we talk about the words abduction, induction, and deduction, for we fully understand there's many other different ways of thinking about this? Any comments? Or Alf, you want to add anything?
No, I think this covers it. It's I'm a little surprised if there's no questions, but that's okay. We can move on. We'll even take snide remarks if you have them. But
very nice.
I posted a question.
Here we go. Let's see.
Zahira?
Yeah.
Here, would you like to ask a question?
Yes.
I posted a question in the chat. What about methodological implications for the 3? I know it's a big question, but you mentioned quantitative and qualitative in induction, so I thought a quick comment on that would be fantastic.
Well, methodologically, these are 3 different modes of reasoning. It's the way you think about things. The methodology It's open to many different methodologies, but deduction is a logical descending, a ladder of abstraction from general principles or theoretically abstract concepts down to particular observables. That's the methodology. Induction goes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, for deduction, I'm assuming most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the classic example of major premise, all men are mortal, minor premise, Socrates is a man, therefore, it's syllogistic reasoning, but it's major premise, minor premise, and if both are valid, both are true, then the conclusion must be valid.
Yep.
Um,
Very good. Induction works the reverse, where you go from particular observables, count the different numbers, and go toward probabilities and statistical averages of a population. And abduction, of course, is what we're going to be discussing here. One that is the process of creation, creating a new idea. Okay. Anything else?
Hi, Professor. Can I ask a question, please?
Please,
First
yes.
of all, good morning.
Paula.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a huge fan of your work. I use your book as a methodology professor in Brazil. And I remember that you used the example of the apple falling from the tree as an abduction. And sometimes we learn, before your book, I used to think about this as an induction process. So I'd like you to comment on that a little bit. What is the difference between induction and abduction? I understand that is the surprise, but sometimes when we are in the process of research, we might confuse those two elements. So I'd love to hear your comment on that a little bit. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Can I skip ahead to address this point? Suppose I am looking at a lake and I find 10 swans swimming in this lake. And I notice that one of them is black. Huh, that's a surprise. Wait a minute, I thought all swans were white. So by induction, if this is a valid sample of a population, I will have to conclude that by induction, 90% of swans are white, 10% are black. Induction. By deduction, I would therefore conclude that I have to reject my hypothesis that all swans are white. But by abduction, now I notice this anomaly and I ask myself, what's going on here? What I thought, I'll bet you there are some hunches here that explain why this one is black. It could be a migration problem. I know that black swans live in Australia, but surely they wouldn't get up to the UK, would they? But it's a possibility. Another one might be it's a mutation. Maybe this is a swan that it represents the starting of a new species, biological, genetic. Or I could say, no, that swan is black because it was in polluted water. And yes, indeed, I checked the lake and I found there was polluted water there. So I have 3 creative germs, a hunch, conjectures, half-baked ideas. And now I'm going to evaluate those 3, so I select the most plausible one. So does that address your question, Paula?
Yes, that's a great example. Thank you very much.
Yes.
The one thing you can also notice is that even deduction plays a small part in this. And that is that once you've observed the black swan, you can deductively conclude that not all swans are white. That must be true. So that's deduction. So all these processes of deduction, induction, and abduction, as we started with, are highly interrelated.
So notice what we start off with when you think of abductive reasoning. You begin to see that our minds are full of expectations. In other words, we do not enter the world with a clean slate, as they say. Instead, we enter the world with a full slate of experiences, of education, of disciplines, of that leads us to look at the world and to most of the time, explain it. It's a good, normal, everyday occurrence. But we also are going to notice exceptions, especially when we have a prepared mind. Exceptions are not just anomalies that happen to occur, they are hunches that need to be verified. And so the creative process of generating new ideas to solve an anomaly used to be thought of as a eureka moment. Some spontaneous, bright, creative person came up in a flash of inspiration to come up with a new hunch, new idea, new theory. And we argue against that. And indeed, if you look at the literature on this subject, you find that it goes far more deeply, and there is a more systematic way of looking through the moves that we make as we develop and create theory. For example, in what led to the discovery of penicillin, Alexander Fleming reported in 1928 that he was cleaning a pile of petri dishes growing bacteria that was piled in the sink. Some mold was growing on one of the dishes, but that was not unusual. But all around the mold, the staph bacteria had been killed. Huh, that's funny. Very surprising. Another example, in 1992, scientists at Pfizer were testing a pill to fight angina. Unfortunately for the afflicted, it had a little success against the disease. Though it didn't work, the men taking part in the study refused to give up their medicine. That's funny. What's going on? Well, this led to Viagra. You see the process of abduction. You notice an anomaly, you analyze it, you create a hunch, and you select the hunch for further subsequent deductive theory construction and inductive theory testing. Example, Mary Zelmer Brun, my colleague, was doing field studies and observed that teams were learning more when they were interrupted. In several instances of losing team members, changing tools, organizational restructuring, was this happening? What explains this? She asked. Might the interruptions get teams out of their ruts? Hunch. Interruptions provide opportunities to learn ways to do work better. Aha. Another example, Amy Edmondson. Studying medical errors in hospitals, she discovered that high-performing teams make more errors than low-performing teams. That's a surprise. That's funny. Did high-performing teams really make more mistakes? What explains this? Well, the good teams, Edmondson reasoned, do not make more mistakes. They report more. Hunch. One potential mechanism that would explain the anomaly is a shared belief that making a mistake will not be held against them. Aha. And on went this work toward safety. My own personal experience as a doctoral student was that I went with Dr. Andre Dalbec to attend neighborhood block meetings in order to identify the needs of low-income people in the housing area. And after the Dane County Community Action, the officials asked, what difficulties do you have living in this neighborhood? Nobody talked. That's funny. Huh? What do you mean nobody talks when you're starting a meeting? Well, Andre Delbecq sent me off to the library and he said, go find out what's wrong. What leads people not to talk in a meeting? And of course, you know, all of the factors, racial, minority, all the other factors that lead individuals to not speak up. But there was a study by Taylor and Osborne that found that individuals working alone generate more ideas than when they work together. Aha! Andre suggested, let's start the meeting by not letting people talk. Ha! How about that? That's a creative germ. And so we'll start the meeting with silent writing of ideas on a question. And that, of course, then led to some round robin procedure for getting people to share their ideas on a flip chart, which in turn led to a preliminary vote to determine what to talk about, and then a discussion of all of those ideas, ending with the final vote. But it was that silent idea. Let me stop at this point and ask questions about your examples or our examples about abduction. Because you see, we do it all the time, but we need to know the moves we are making. And that's the point of our paper. These 4 steps. Observe the anomaly, confirm the anomaly, generate hunches, and evaluate hunches. And we point out, notice it goes on not only at the individual level, but the group collective level.
Andy, before we get into this, should we take a couple of questions?
Absolutely. Shall we?
I see Rinda, and forgive me if I mispronounce your name, have her hand up.
Oh, good.
Yes, hi. My question is, if I look at the phenomenon of women entrepreneurs, and that's my field of study, women entrepreneurs have navigated, some of them have navigated the space of COVID-19 pretty well. Now, is that a process of abduction? Or is it something which they were expected to do using technology? So how do I position that problem is what I'm asking.
I'm not sure how to respond because I guess I don't understand the context well enough. Or Alf, do you have some thoughts? Or please, Lisa.
No, it depends on, is this an anomaly you're seeing, or is this some novel phenomenon, or something you can't explain?
For example, literature tells me that women should not have performed well, but they are, and some of them have. For example, remote working should have taken women out of the workforce, for example. So I don't know how to position that, and that's exactly what I'm asking, because that's a phenomenon that I see, but I don't know how to frame that, question that. Therefore, I'm leaving the question out in the open.
Well, it sounds to me like depending on your methodology and your data, if you have data to show that, then that's interesting in itself, because you have data that provides evidence that what's going on contradicts the literature. Sure. And I'm not that familiar with that body of literature to.
Well, indeed, you could find, and many of us do as scholars, as we're reading the literature, we come up and we read about findings that are surprising to us, that are funny, that
Right.
don't fit
Right.
our expectation. In other words, we get our anomalies from the literature just as much as we do from real world observations, point one. And then as step one he suggests, you notice only certain people are going to be attentive to those anomalies. Only if you know the literature are you going to know about this surprise.
Fair.
If you didn't know the literature, you just pass it by. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Andy and Steinar, we have 5 more hands raised. Oh, in fact,
Okay.
6 now.
Wonderful.
Would you like to take those questions now?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, Lisa, would you like to go next?
Sure. So as I was listening to this, I was struck by, this sounds a lot like what I do in a discussion section of a quantitative paper. For instance, I hypothesize something about women are more likely to remain in their organizations when there are women in leadership. I find that's not true. So in the discussion, I tried to generate some ideas about why this might be. Is that abduction?
It certainly is, isn't it?
It sounds like it.
Yeah. And that's the neat thing. But notice when you go through abductive reasoning, you're thinking in a very different way than when you're going through a deductive or an inductive process. Abduction is creativity, coming up with a new hunch, a half-baked idea, as opposed to a logical conclusion, or as opposed to a statistical aggregation. And that's the point of our 4 steps here, is to point out, notice the process of thinking in an abductive procedure so that we can follow our own and those of others as we develop and improve our theory creation. Okay, other questions?
Ravi, good to see you, by the way.
Likewise. So as I was kind of looking at some of these examples, a lot of times, especially in qualitative research, they're presented as part of an inductive template. People don't typically use the word, here's abduction happening. And there is this sort of, for better or worse, this grounded theory baggage of, well, you come into the field with no expectations, you're not listening to prior theory. And so without coming in with these expectations of prior theory, abduction doesn't really make sense because that's oftentimes the source of the mystery. So I was curious if you could kind of talk a little bit about how we sort of manage that tension between how we portray our findings versus kind of how we actually come up with them. Because it seems like there's probably a heck of a lot more abduction going on than actually appears in the journals. So if you could kind of talk about that tension and whether you see there being in your sort of template here, a way to sort of justify the abductive move, because it is a little mysterious and it isn't as clear as inductive coding. So any sort of insights on that would be very appreciated.
Although some methodologists, using case study or qualitative methods, assume that researchers can have a clean slate and have no theory and have no preconceptions until they observe phenomena. The answer is that's not possible. We are human beings. We have social biases. Those include all of our past experiences, all of the knowledge that we, in the cultural situations in which we've lived, and knowledge of the literature and disciplines that we've learned. And we don't know many of the others. As Pogge said, what you see is also what you not see. So that in turn then leads to the first statement, like Charles Peirce said, the American pragmatist, that abduction is the form in which creative ideas emerge by recognizing it is the surprises, the anomalies that lead one to think, what's going on here? And that in turn then is precisely the spark, the opportunity for creativity. It's the uncertainties, the quest for trying to understand something that we need to examine. I don't know if I addressed your question. Is there anything further, or Alf?
I don't want to take too much time because I know there are many people with hands raised, but just,
All right.
you know, aside from AMD, just the tension between, yes, that's maybe how we come up with our ideas, is there are these puzzles and then we iterate back and try to resolve them, especially in qualitative field work. But then the gap between that is our actual process versus the ways that we have to present it in terms of accepted templates, in terms of, you know, coding schemes where you can't really just say, oh, I was sitting there and all of a sudden this idea, this hunch came to me. People want like, oh, what's your coding process? Let me see the quotes. Let me see. So it just seems to be this kind of vague, nebulous thing. And I was curious maybe if some of what you're presenting today could maybe systematic, like make it more systematic, justify it better, make it more acceptable, make it more publishable, that sort of thing.
Notice what the reviewers are doing is asking about step 2 of this abductive process. Whereas you, number 1, observe an anomaly and you can describe it. But the reviewer is going to say, check it out, show me. It's a matter of your method that came up with this anomaly. It doesn't really exist. It's that kind of step 2 need to confirm the anomaly, grounding the anomaly up close and from afar, diagnosing its characteristics and its context, and then also not by yourself, but with others, converging on an agreement that, yes, indeed, there is an anomaly out there. There's the tension, isn't it? Okay. Lee, I see you. What question do you have?
Yeah, you guys are kind of touched upon it, and Ravi put it really nicely actually then with how he was putting it across. My question was to do with the events that occurred before step 1. Because with my research at the minute, working with emancipatory entrepreneurialism with ex-offenders and their time inside prison, I approached the research with this idea about emancipatory processes that may or may not be happening, but I thought with a fairly kind of open mind, and so I would describe it as an inductive process. But then through gathering the data, just to see what people would, via interviews, just to see what people would talk about their experiences and what came to mind, that then generated a hunch around, oh, there seems to be something happening here with identity transitions, which then moved the research into an occupational identity route. So I suppose the question is around, and apologies if you guys are going to want to talk about this, but those steps that come before step 1, or is that just muddying the waters of kind of saying, well, there's induction and then there's abduction and it can kind of move back and forth?
Well, you know, these steps can occur so quickly that they seem to be simultaneous. But as I listen to you, Lee, in terms of this framework, you're jumping from step 1 to step 3 and 4, which takes you back to 1 and so forth, because you were generating some anomaly for which you had some hunches, and you're exploring alternative hunches in order to know what procedure to take next. So from the point of view of this framework, you're going through these steps, because I did not hear you going through a process of deduction nor induction. Instead, you are looking more at problem solution pairs. That is to say, you see a problem that immediately is connected with a solution, and that solution in turn may vary with a further hunch. Yep. Katerina, did you have a question?
Yes, I have one question, just a short one. First of all, thank you, Professor Van de Ven. I'm really very much appreciating your work and reading about the process studies. And recently we have been also discussing with the qualitative research methods course, kind of made a debate about abductive process theorizing, inductive and deductive. But my question relates, like, for example, if you are in the process of analyzing the data, and of course you enter the field not with an empty mind, but then you're stuck in the decision making, induction or abduction. So what to do at this point, how to convince yourself and others, for example, your supervisors, your reviewers, of going with the right approach. So what comes to your mind of argumentation to this? Thank you very much.
Well, you say you are analyzing data.
Yes.
Presumably you're doing that for a reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
You got a question in mind or something. So in a sense, what you are doing is inductively examining data.
Mm-hmm.
But you still have a mind of your own. So you're going through the methodologies and the steps to evaluate whether or not your question is being addressed. But in the process, you come up with some hunches, some surprises, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think the data would turn out to be this way.
Mm-hmm.
Now you ask the abductive question, what's going on?
Right.
That's funny.
Right.
Alf?
Mm-hmm.
No, that's what I was going to add. You can sit there and do, qualitative can range from case studies to various kinds of coding, and you sit there and work with the data, and then something shows up that violates your expectations. And expectations are based on literature, theory, what you came into the field with. And it's when you find this thing that surprises you, what we call an anomaly, which is a novel phenomenon that is heretofore unexplained by existing theories, then the abductive process starts. It's because people are natural generators of explanations. We need to understand our environment. So when we see something that doesn't fit, we naturally start inventing explanations so that it would make sense to us. And so it's this process that you can take advantage of through the abductive reasoning process that we propose.
Alicia, you had a question. Alicia, are you there? You are muted. Or Subhanjan?
Is that me? EBM. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much,
Subhanjan?
sir.
Yes.
Should I go ahead?
Please do.
Okay, thank you. I was going to ask about the relationship between phenomenology and abduction, because for phenomenology, the expectation is that you're looking at a phenomenon from a participant's first personal experience, first person point of view. The reason why I'm asking is that I'm looking at authentic leadership, right? And I've commenced my pilot study where some of my participants have already shared some insights that I did not find in literature. So my first question is this: can you do phenomenology using an abductive line of reasoning? And secondly, based on these hunches that I've developed from my pilot interview, am I supposed to now start offering alternatives? Wouldn't that be bias? Wouldn't that be my personal explanations? Or I'm just supposed to continue interviewing to get more anomalies? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your question. It's a loaded question. Phenomenology, yes, is, if I'm correct, an attempt to understand phenomena, right? And it does so in a social construction manner, that is, a perceived manner. And it does not necessarily rely on rational, logical thinking, but it could be very experiential or emotional or based on faith. Well, having said all of that, the complexity now is, where does abduction fit into all of that phenomenology? I guess it does when you get surprised, when your logic or your emotion or your beliefs get questioned. And that in turn then triggers you to confirm the anomaly and proceed ahead to generate possible explanations, hunches, that then with others, you can evaluate step 4 to select the explanation or the hunch that seems to be the most plausible. What do you think, Alf?
No, that sounds about right to me. I thought I heard a slightly different description of phenomenology, but the sound was breaking up. So
Okay.
but
And-
now I think we have Alicia back with us.
Oh, good. Hi there.
Hi,
Alicia?
do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry for the problem. I'm just having a question about how do you know? I mean, there's always something missing and surprising, or sometimes because you want to try or to find something new, but then, or if someone else found it. So I don't know if it's a dumb question or not, but I'm just wondering that.
No, it's not a dumb question. In fact, we get exposed to so many surprises, we can't possibly deal with them all. Isn't that right? And that's what makes this world a buzzing, blooming, confusing place. So you and I and everybody else can only handle and deal with so many anomalies in this world. And so because I'm a social scientist and more or less a sociologist, I tend to focus more on issues, phenomena in my discipline or in the areas where I'm an expert, or that is to say, where I know the literature and I can spot things.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not an ornithologist, let's say. And so I do have this very nice bird feeder. But to be honest, I don't know when I see a new bird or an old bird, because I don't know, they look pretty, but I don't know enough. My mind is not prepared enough to know when I have detected an anomalous bird species. So I just let those pass by. I don't pay attention to those anomalies. I don't even recognize them as anomalies. And that's the thing with most of us. We all sort of go along in this world being incredibly adaptive without recognizing that we are simply fitting what could be anomalous situations into and within our existing stock of knowledge.
So that means that most of us go through the world most of the time, fitting our experiences into our existing theories. That is, in essence, adapting our experiences to our existing theories instead of holding our theories loosely and our anomalies firmly, and trying to adapt our theories to our experiences. So we're routinely missing opportunities for abductive thinking.
Yeah. Okay, someone else?
Yes. Hello, Professor Shubhanjan this side from Delhi.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. It has been amazing to listen to this. And I have a very elementary question. Is it that induction is associated with theory generation, deduction with theory testing, and abduction with theory elaboration? And how do we differentiate, and where does anomaly fit in? Thank you.
Alf, you want to answer that?
Well, my initial reaction is that deduction is about theory elaboration or fleshing out a theory. Once you have derived a pure hypothesis, you can flesh it out through deduction into a full-fledged theory consisting of a set of hypotheses. And then induction is, I think that's what you said, the testing of the theory. And abduction is what we talk about here is the generation of novel theory.
Mm-hmm. Good. Namrata. Oh, could you are muted.
Yes, sorry. I do have to, I got kicked out, something happened with my internet. So please ignore me if you've kind of dealt with this question already. I'll hear it on the recording. So can we say that, where does the surprise come from? I think when I got kicked out, somebody was asking that question. Can the surprise, we often, in the course of doing our inductive qualitative analysis, we see something totally surprising, okay, that doesn't completely fit with the existing theory. And so I think, and that's amazing, that you don't try, and that's the opportunity to build, on theory. So then where is that? There seems to be a fine line there between, is abduction that different?
It is the finest line in that what tends to happen if we are in a deductive or an inductive mode is that we throw out the outlier and dismiss it, as opposed to saying, here's an opportunity for another paper.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yes. And Silky, you have a question. You are also muted, Silky. I hope
Sorry, I just clicked on my camera. Many thanks. This is very insightful, your presentation, and also the dialogue. Just to confirm my thoughts, the black swan, it could be that it always has been there, but the anomaly has been ignored. Am I correct, or does it have to be a novel phenomenon?
No, it could have been there for years.
Okay, and
but if we haven't observed it, it's until now it's a novel phenomenon.
Okay, I think I have something in mind which probably has been observed but has been ignored in research.
Well, I think that it happens for, indeed, in the physical sciences, that's what we're looking for all the time, isn't it?
Yeah, okay.
Characteristics of the world that have not been explained or observed before. And now we're trying to understand black holes.
Right.
And etc.
Okay, then that's
and just because we haven't seen them before doesn't mean they haven't been there all along.
Yeah, okay, so that's also the interpretation of novel then. Okay, and if I have a hunch for a different explanation, maybe a different theory that can explain this anomaly better, and then I look inductively how I can, test that new explanation. This can still be qualitatively.
Oh, indeed it could. In other words, after you've gone through the steps, you then move on to deductive fleshing out and inductive testing of a hunch, the ones that you chose. And that can be done qualitatively, quantitatively, using whatever methodology and data sources address the research question.
Okay, many thanks for that.
Many thanks. Sarah and Frank, is that right? So Sarah, you have a question. You are also on mute.
Sorry, I just have a quick question. What is the difference, would you say, between retroduction and abduction? Because to me,
they are the same.
It's like, the same.
Yeah.
So
Charles first, they are the same. Charles first would say and called it retroduction.
Okay.
And then
before he called it abduction, so he changed the terminology of but they're the same.
Because in all the critical realist literature, by Bhaskar and all that, I mean, it's mostly spoken of retroduction. So I'm always confused. Reading the two. So I was wondering.
Very good. And Frank, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. What's your view on the distinction or similarity between abduction and harking? We all, sometimes research, reviewers say, hey, your theorizing sounds like harking, but
yes. Hypothesizing after the results are known, harking.
Yeah.
And that is not being honest if you are following the logical, deductive, or pardon me, inductive mode of research. But hypothesizing after results are known, especially when they are surprises and are hunches, that is abduction, except you're doing it in a legal way.
Well, I think also you can do harking in a legal way. I think what we both, Andy and I, object to is what we call sharking. which is secretly hypothesizing after the results are known.
Yes.
Now, if you, because you can't articulate all hypotheses and test them a priori, you can hark, but then you do it transparently, which is tharking. The challenge is with getting journals to publish that, but that's a legitimate way to do it.
Yes. And Lida, you have a question, and then we want to move on for the other discussion. Please.
Yes, thank you for the dialogue. I just want to confirm my understanding. So I think what happens very frequently is that we identify anomaly. It's something we cannot explain. Oftentimes it's because the literature or we as a whole, the researchers, haven't explained this phenomenon using an appropriate theoretical perspective or the theory. So is that correct? Before we try to generate a new theory, we really want to make sure it's not that the theory exists, but we haven't used this theory to explain this phenomenon. But it's really, we haven't got the right theory. So my question is, before we generate a new theory to explain this phenomenon, we need to make sure that really we don't have the appropriate theory to explain this anomaly. Is this what you are? Is this aligned with your idea?
Well, yes, in the following sense. In step one, you observe an anomaly. And because of your cognitive attention or flexibility and your own depth of knowledge in the literature, and so you say, there's an anomaly here, but it's good to check it out. It's good to find out, is this an anomaly, in two regards. Number one, talk to others, that is to say, collectively. Get others to observe this phenomenon to find out, is this the way I think it is? Is this the anomaly that I think it exists? That's point one. But the other one is, someone else might tell you, yeah, that is the way you think it is, but here's the theory that's been used to explain it, and it works perfectly well. So here's a case where you may think you have an anomaly, but others that you talk with in a collective sense may say, we don't know that already by this theory. It's explained.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
This is
and that's why that's the example of the Fleming example is, the prepared mind.
Yeah.
You're an expert in the field, and it's also why you do step two. And it's also why, and I guess this is a nice lead-in to talking through this slide. It's also when you move into the collective level of it, because you check with others. So are you seeing this also? Do you understand this? Do you know a theory that explains this? And then if there is, then it's not an anomaly, because it's a phenomenon that is already explained by some other body of literature.
Yeah. Oftentimes we see publications, like newly published papers that start the paper with something like, we have been explaining this phenomenon using this theoretical perspective, but there is something we cannot explain. Now, I'm going to bring this another theoretical perspective to explain this phenomenon. So this is the moment when we don't need to create a new theory, but we just need to explain this phenomenon using a different theoretical perspective. So this is not the time to do abduction, right?
Right. Well, finding an existing theory that explains the phenomenon not only makes it not an anomaly, but it's also akin to a court of law. In a court of law, frivolous cases are thrown out in a court of law. You see, in social science, if we have theories that explain phenomena adequately, then becomes a frivolous case to say that this is an anomaly.
Mm.
It becomes a relevant case to say we need to replicate or this further in different contexts, but maybe the existing theory is already well known in certain locations or contexts.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes. So notice as you go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4, the relationship between individual behavior and the collective group behavior grows from divergence to convergence to divergence to convergence. And the process goes from individual in step 1 primarily, but becomes more and more collective as you go to step 2, 3, and 4. When you start looking at the creative process of doing research, we find increasingly that co-authors, collaborators who work together serve as checks and balances on one another, so that I may observe a divergent anomaly. And my co-author, when asked to do so, would agree or disagree. And if he disagreed, then I'd have to start to develop an argument for saying, no, I really do think there is an anomaly here. Whereas the other may say, well, drop it. But even if I do see an anomaly in step 2, I want to confirm that that anomaly exists up close and from afar. Up close is to provide particular instances observable. From afar is to know that, well, this is not a unique instance. This is quite pervasive. It's a problem, a phenomenon, an anomaly that seems to justify undertaking significant study. And by diagnosing the characteristics and the context, we then begin to obtain literature from others and findings and observations from colleagues, who in turn then provide the basis for confirming your anomaly. Once you confirm the anomaly with others, then the steps move toward generating hunches. Here we need diverse experiences, a wide variety of different hunches. And for that, we need a wide variety of different co-authors and collaborators, who in turn generate diverse hunches, but then come back in step 4 to help us converge, to synthesize the hunches into those that are plausible. Here are the moves. So the process of generating and evaluating ideas is pretty much generating ideas. The point here is the greater the number of different hunches that you develop, the better. Don't ever settle for one. And use strong different classifications for developing these hunches. Don't fall into a rut, thinking the same way about the phenomenon. Then when it comes to evaluating your ideas or your hunches, the greater the number of different criteria that you use consistently to select hunches, the better. So don't evaluate one hunch because it tastes good, and a second one because it's cheap, and a third one because it's something else. Instead, evaluate your 3 hunches on the same criteria. But notice here, you can't prove anything, because that's down the road when you're developing the theory deductively. All you have is plausibility. And Carl Weick made a very nice argument on the need for plausibility as a substitute for validity in selecting hunches. So if these are the steps, then you've got these levels going on. At the individual level, it's pretty much like Carl Weick was suggesting. It's an individual, an evolutionary process. of variation, selection, and retention of anomalies and hunches, where you can generate many diverse hunches, as many as you can, and evaluate the hunches with the same criteria. But our generation and our evaluations tend to be limited to partial insights that can be overcome with the involvement of collective dialectical processes, where with a partner, trusting partners, there can be sparring, there can be debate, there can be a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, where one's partial hunches are complemented by others and they fuse into collective ideas. So evaluation, criticism goes deeper, and with a group of creative hunches. And Verganti wrote this nice book. Go ahead, Alf.
One thing that's worth noticing is that the process changes fundamentally as you move from individual level to the collective level. It goes from being an evolutionary process to becoming a dialectical process.
Yeah.
So those are fundamentally different.
Mm-hmm. And so as you move from me out to a pair, radical circle, interpreters, a big conference, we are moving from inside out, and where we're going through these different processes. Whereas for me, I might be undergoing an evolutionary process. When we get into the sparring, clashing, and fusing and questioning areas, that's a dialectical process. And social science really is fundamentally a dialectical process, collectively, where there's always questioning and where there's never proof, if you will, of anything. But there are more plausible, more convergent schools of thought. So collective abduction, for example, to Tversky and Kahneman, is nicely summarized here. When one of us would say something, it was off the wall. The others would search for virtue in it. We would finish each other's sentences and frequently did, but we also kept surprising each other. It still gives me goosebumps. That's Dan Kahneman speaking about Tversky. They wrote together, sitting right next to each other at the typewriter, recalls Michigan psychologist Richard Nisbet. The way Danny put it, it was, we were sharing a mind. They both find it pointless to allocate credit, as their thoughts felt like a chemical byproduct of their interaction. So as we move from individual to collective, we also move from individual to collective memories. And at some stage in this game, we lose sight of whose ideas was which. And after all, the best of scholarship, according to Tversky and Kahneman, is a development of this shared mind, where it's the idea, not the person, that matters. So I can, if you will, conclude with some prescriptions for abductive theory creation, and then we can have a further discussion about them. All right. So if you think of abduction as a 4-step process of thinking, 4 steps of behavior, where step 1 is to observe and cherish anomalies. Chance favors the prepared mind. So the individuals likely to be prepared will be those who have studied in depth and in breadth and are flexible and open to surprises. They seek divergent views of the anomaly with others, because maybe it's just a figment of my imagination that leads me to say there's an anomaly here. Check it out. Second, confirm the anomaly, grounding the anomaly up close and from afar. And that's to avoid the type 3 error. It's also to avoid frivolous cases that are thrown out in courts of law. And this requires diagnosing and converging on anomalies with others, not just by yourself. Notice we're talking about theory building and theory creation as a collective achievement more than an individual achievement. Step 3, generating hunches, seeking many alternatives. Avoid jumping to any one solution by diverging and getting divergent hunches from other people, collaborators, colleagues. And then finally, evaluating hunches, selecting the plausible ones, where plausibility is the substitute for validity, and where we want to converge in the selection criteria with others. Alf, you want to add anything else?
No, I think this about covers it. I think there are, I want to call them errors, but the mistakes that you can commit in each step. And we've talked about each of them, so I just want to draw your attention to them again. And that's it's in step 1. It is sort of letting the world sail by, or the error of insensitivity. There's often little we can do about the strength of the signal of things that happen at the periphery of our experience. But what we can do something about is the sensitivity of the observer, to pay more attention, pay more careful attention to things. We do step 2 in order to avoid type 3 errors, which Andy talked about. And we do step 3 in order to avoid jumping to solutions. Because the first conjecture that comes to mind, which we tend to fall in love with, because it was our idea, is often not the best. So you need to work with others to try and generate a wide range of hunches based on a diverse set of perspectives. So here the inclusion of diverse perspectives becomes very important. And in step 4, of course, it's the usual selection biases and errors that you can make in selecting the best hunches that you're trying to avoid. So that's just a little repetition on those things. And that's why you have this process. And in our rather complex world, the collective level becomes incredibly important.
Comments or questions?
Andy, do you have more slides?
I have more slides.
You have more slides. So this is just posing for questions.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Alicia, would you like to go first?
Yeah, Alicia.
I'm just wondering, because you said it is better to have different hunches on the same criteria at the beginning. Yeah. But what do you mean by the same criteria if it is in step 1?
Well, in step 1, you want to get others to see if the anomaly that you observe is verified. Does someone else see the anomaly like I see it? Or is this just a figment of my imagination? That's your question, isn't it?
Yes, but you said different hunches. And then you said we need to have
different hunches. I'm trying to understand. Did you say hunches?
It's better to have different hunch, the seeds of the new theory.
Yes. And so the idea is, don't ever settle for your first hunch.
Okay.
Always generate more hunches that you will then select from among. And I also, in my courses on engaged scholarship, I emphasize, don't ever just test one proposition or theory. Compare alternative theories. That is to say, when you are proposing a proposition, let's say you are a human resource manager or scholar, and you propose investing in human resources increases organization performance. Fine, but notice that's not a very important, well, it's important, but it would have much more impact if I added a disjunctive proposition to this, namely, investing in human resources more strongly influences organization performance than investing in capital. Now you are juxtaposing the theory of capital investment with the theory of human resource investment. And then you're going to have some important conclusion. Yeah. Oh, really? Is that correct? How I say it? Yes, thank you. You are now muted. Ask to unmute. Arila? You.
Sorry. Technical problem. So I have I have a small question. The way I understood the abduction reasoning is that you focus on the outlier. So I'm just wondering that if one go to the field and maybe you collect a bunch of interviews or maybe you observe a phenomenon and then you notice that there's an anomaly and there's maybe an outlier, but then you only have a small set of data on what seems to be the funny thing here. What do you do if that data is not enough to like actually create or write a paper? So I'm just really wondering in terms of evidence, in terms of how do you build a theory if you only have a small portion of observation, if it makes sense?
I think the way I think about responding to your question, which is a good question, is that I don't need inductive generalizations of a population. All I need is to see one black swan in a lake of 10 birds. To start developing a hunch that, I thought all swans were white. And that leads me then to begin my abductive quest. What's going on here? Why this black swan? And to come up with hunches that may then lead to subsequent theory construction. Does that address your point?
Okay. Yeah.
So you're looking at the thing that you're calling an outlier. What you're basically addressing is what the heck makes that so different? And abduction is much more tenuous and tentative than induction is.
Oh yeah.
It's speculative. You're generating explanations for what makes that so different.
Thank you.
Jonathan, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. So Dr. Van de Ven, in the paper, in your 1995 paper with Dr. Poole, you mentioned, or you discussed the notion of the idea evolving rather than creating out of nothing. And I was wondering, through the discussion we've had today, does the evolution idea of theory and essentially evolving from existing theory, existing ideas, limit the abilities to create new ideas?
Well, it does, but if you take Donald Campbell's statement about blind variations as opposed to random variations, that basically says that you may very intentionally come up with a very interesting idea because of your unique circumstance that I may not know about. So your seemingly creative insight is blind to me because I can't see it. And the distinction that Donald Campbell says is be careful. Ideas don't come out of blind alleys or faceless, nameless ideas, nor are they serendipitous events. Most of the time, ideas, the creation of new ideas are blind to us, but they're certainly not to the developers.
Yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate the clarification there.
Yep, very nice. Thank you. Katrina.
Yes, I have one more question, actually referring to step 1, where you state that we should observe and cherish anomalies. So basically, my question is, what kind of observation techniques would you recommend at this stage? So, for example, like narrative reflections together with your research group, or analyzing collectively the data. And I think that it's also not only at the first step, it's kind of a evolving process, and you can observe and cherish these anomalies also maybe through the whole process of analyzing data. It's not just as a first step when you code the data as first order code. So I think it's more kind of developing process. Is it right?
That is exactly correct. It is certainly not a sequential process like our picture shows, nor is it a rational necessarily process, because there's a lot of discontinuities in between all of these steps. But what is important, I think, in these steps is that it provides us some guidance in theory, in creating a theory. There's a lot of people who actually do think that like my second slide showed, eureka moments, just flashes of bright insight. When you look more carefully at how they develop, mere mortals are very capable of creating insightful theories if we think through the steps that we are following. And to be honest, for me, I know when I'm doing this abduction, because when I'm going through this process, I feel very uptight. I feel very uncertain. I feel emotionally charged. I feel tension, precisely because there is this buzzing, blooming, confusing thing I saw out there, and I don't know what to make of it. And I try different things, different hunches back and forth, and I never feel satisfied. Not for 2 weeks or a month or a year even. But this is a good state to be in, is what I tell myself. Because when you are in this state, you are in a creative state. Don't jump out of the creative state in order to simply satisfy your quest for relieving tension in your mind or frustration. I don't know, others, do you experience this tension? I know I do.
Yes, as we are all researchers. But would you recommend maybe some kind of techniques also, maybe observation of these anomalies, like using some narrative approach? Do you use personally this in your practice when you analyze the data or not? Oh,
I certainly do. Once I see an anomaly, and when I develop some hunches, I conduct, if you will, not only with my co-author, but with collegial team. I conduct anomaly group meeting, anomaly group brainstorming techniques, where I present a question. Here is my hunch, or here is what I think is an anomaly. What do you think? And asking them to respond by reflecting on the question. And then we generate ideas that then are amazingly helpful to me for seeing new dots that are connected to, that may be connected to the overall phenomenon.
Great, thank you very much.
Fernando, huh? Fernanda?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I am thrilled to be here. I am also a fan of your work, and I also use your book, by the way.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Well, I am very happy to know that this paper is ready to be published in AMR. And I would like to know, my first question is to know your view regarding this work as a function of the paper published by Albeson 2011 in AMR, entitled Creating Mystery or something like that. I see this piece talking to that piece from different paradigmatic perspectives. I don't know if my reading is correct.
Please go ahead and tell us, because I don't recall the paper that you mentioned in 2011, unless Alf, you do, and tell us how you see them informing one another or diverging from one another. But
right.
I really
well,
respect Albeson.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't remember exactly the path that Albeson creates in leading to mystery, on how they resolve the mystery. But I see abduction as a mystery, as a surprise, an unknown. And then you go ahead and you solve that mystery cognitively and behaviorally. And the way I see it is that you are coming more from and please accept my bad reading if it is a bad reading of what I am listening, which is much more positivistic in a way, compared to Albeson, that comes from a social construction. You talk about collective understanding, which that brings social construction. So I guess my question is more to continue this conversation. I'll probably email you with more fine-tuned thoughts about this.
Thank you. I would like that very much. But one
and
thing
then
for sure, I just want to comment. Certainly you are correct that Albeson is much more of a what would you say, humanist or relativist perspective.
Well, he's a critical theorist, is what he is.
Yep. Whereas I see
and the Albeson and Karaman article, it's been quite a number of years since I read it, but it's excellent, as is most of the stuff that Albeson does. He's a tremendous guy, but like I said, we have different ontological perspectives in terms of that, because neither Andy nor I are critical theorists.
Right.
No, we take more of a realist. I'd say ours is more of a realist perspective, which says that we believe there's a real world out there, but that is to say, there is a real world outside of our mental capability. But epistemologically, our capability of appreciating and seeing that world is highly subjective and fraught with measurement or other errors. So the world is socially constructed from the point of view of any observer, even though it may be real out there. So that's the kind of a realist perspective that I know I take, and I think Alf does too.
Right.
Go ahead. Thank you. I have a second question, if I may. Otherwise, I can skip it.
Sure. The question I have is, Ibrat, what is our time? Because I do have a couple of closing points to make, but how much time do we have for continued questioning?
I think we have about another 35 minutes until we finish.
Okay.
And we have 4 more hands raised at the moment.
Very nice. Okay, please continue on, Fernando.
so my question has to do with emotions, and you mentioned that in this surprise of looking at something that is unexpected, and there is this tension, and I agree with you, this is a good state, right?
Yes.
Now, my question is, does your theory involves emotions? I didn't see it in your presentation.
Well, I can only say that I feel emotion. I may not be writing about it because I'm trying to be coherent in communicating some ideas. Alf, do you have any comments on that? Because I don't.
No, we didn't explicitly talk about emotion, but what insights do you have to offer on that with regards to abduction?
That's a question to me?
Yes.
Yeah, because I see a line of theory in organizational research. Particularly, I have in mind a paper on organizational learning that talks about wonder and curiosity. And I see a strong connection between the abductive process of being surprised and feeling this wonder, and then go ahead and explore, which is the curiosity aspect. So I see like two different dimensions. On the one hand, this cognitive behavioral way that you have of explaining abduction, and then on a different dimension, these emotions and states of wonder and curiosity.
Yeah, yeah,
right.
Very good.
In stage one, we do talk about cognitive flexibility, which I think, at least in my mind, deals with some of the same things that you could talk about as curiosity. It's this ability to jump sets, so to speak.
Par Ahlstrom, you have a question.
Yes, thank you, Professor Saetre and Van der Ven. Extremely interesting. I'm really intrigued by this notion of kind of making explicit for yourself the reasoning process behind theory building. I think that's very powerful. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on something that I'm thinking a bit about myself, which is it necessary and or indeed possible to share that kind of with reviewers and readers when you write things up, or how do you write things up? Do you actually go through the same process of writing it up in those steps, or do you just give readers the final result?
Well, actually, you often give readers the final result, but it does give you some ideas on how to communicate that result. You can certainly include in your methodology how you came up with an idea by beginning the paper by describing the anomaly up close. For example, Joe Blow lost his job, can't find work, is suffering from all kinds of physical and mental problems. Pervasive. Next, in general, Joe Blow's not alone. So many hundreds of thousands of people are without work, and they cannot find that anything good. Researchers can't find anything good that's happening to these people. And so from afar and up close, we can see an anomaly. And the problem is, what do we do with the Joe Blows of this world who can't find work? Then we can go through hunches, job training programs, or is it other kinds of issues? And beginning, but what you see what you're doing though is paragraph 1 of the paper, Joe Blow, paragraph 2, from afar, paragraph 3, what's the research question? What do we do about the Joe Blows of this world? Paragraph 4, hunch. I think it is this, not the status quo, that answers this question. This paper now proceeds ahead. It could be a study that compares your proposal versus the status quo in addressing the problem of Joe Blow. Notice how I have basically gone through the 4 steps in the way I have framed the first 4 paragraphs or 5 paragraphs of the paper.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Ananya, is that correct? Alanya?
Yeah, Ananya is correct. Thank you.
Ananya. Thank you.
Thank you, professors. It's been very insightful. My question is kind of building up on a few others previously asked, and just immediately before this one is the step 2 part of it, which is the confirmation of the anomaly. And I feel that it's critical as a step.
Yes.
Could you please expand upon this and how to do this well? Essentially, I'm trying to ask is how much confirmation is good enough from a publication angle? And are we trying to confirm whether this is an anomaly, or are we trying to say that this has not been previously explained by other theories?
The way the literature has treated that subject is often, this has not been adequately treated by existing theories. In other words, this problem, this anomaly, this puzzle, this question has not been addressed or has been addressed in this way in the literature. But this way in the literature, which is the status quo, does not do the job, is insufficient, needs to be revised, needs to be improved, needs to be substituted with my proposal. Your proposal is your hunch or hunches.
Sure.
Any further comment? Okay, Marwa, you have a question.
Yeah, many thanks, Andy, for this very, very interesting and informative talk. I appreciate it. I'm from the School of the Critical Management Studies, and I have some reflection about your talk today. So you have explained the process of that we go from individual to collective reasoning process, and how innovative or intuitive ideas come throughout this process. And you explained the detailed process about it. And my question relates to, led me to think about or question what the dynamics or the mechanism that help researcher to come up with innovative, intuitive, or ideas, novel ideas in their field. So I'm thinking about how you can theorize the way that you reach to individual and collective steps of abductive reasoning. And I could see you like you have talked this through your experience and your emotional experience about how you connected with developing ideas or developing theories. So what do you think about this point, or what do you think about the mechanism or the dynamics that underpin this process of individual and collective steps of abductive reasoning? And do you think that we need a theory to theorize this?
Well, I'm not sure if we develop a theory, but we develop a proposal for addressing this. And I think the example that I'm thinking about to address your question is this set of quotations from Tversky and Kahneman.
Yeah.
Alf, is that what you read, or can you?
Well, I'm not sure I quite grasped the question. I apologize for that, but
I thought the question was, how do you go from individual experiences of your emotions to a collective group mindset, much like developing that shared mind that was observed here in this quote. and how your partner, your colleague, your collaborator, your co-author continues to surprise you, and yet continues to provide insights that are worth listening to.
Right. Right. And it gets to a point in the process where you have, well, and in particular, if you're looking at the end product, and I think that was the case with us for this paper, is when it's hard to tell where I end and Andy begins, and where I begin and Andy ends when you look at the paper, because it's co-produced. It's not like this bit is mine and this bit is Andy's. That's impossible to say after the fact.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Which reflects there is dynamics or mechanism that is going on during this process.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. And so if you go to slide, hang on, the Verganti figure, I think that's.
Oh yes, there we go. Go ahead.
Right. If you're working on a paper, and this process sort of describes it, and let's say that as an archivist, you're two authors, and so, but the process doesn't stop with two, because our radical circle might be akin to the people we thank in our footnote for commenting on earlier versions of the paper. That's our radical circle. And as you expand it through seminar series, which this would have been a part of if it was before it was accepted, at your department, other people you talk to, then that process continues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Andy, I'm just being conscious that we have about 20 minutes left. And you said you have a couple of more slides you want to cover before maybe, and then we can resume questions again.
Yeah, I have this slide, which I want to share because it also deals with the tug between deduction, induction, and abduction. Now, Dave Wetton is a good colleague, along with many other colleagues in the field of organization and management. And he wrote this 1989 article in the Academy of Management Review, emphasizing that the good contributions are those that are contributions to theory, emphasizing that kind of a rational, deductive, theory-driven refinement and testing approach to theory building. That's what good theorizing is all about. On the other hand, we got a pushback from Donald Hambrick, among many others, who talk about the contributions of practice, the contributions of theory to practice, namely taking a more empiricist approach, an inductive approach, as he calls it, where it's phenomenon driven, and you're trying to describe and diagnose phenomena. And in response, I see Alf and I trying to make a contribution of and to theory. I see this as a theory creation process where we're creating knowledge by abductive thinking. And we are grounding our theory building in the phenomena, but with hunches for addressing those anomalies. So I see it as a third alternative, if you will, to theory creation, making contributions of and to theory. When the earlier, much more positivist approach in the 1960s, 1970s was David Wetton's point, making contributions to theory. And where the pushback from Don Hambrick is the contributions of theory to understanding phenomena. And we're doing both. Any comments about that? Or Alf, maybe you want to add something to this? I know you haven't looked at this one.
No, this is great. I'm seeing it for the first time with the rest of you.
Uh-huh. So in my class of theory building, I do this. I ask my doctoral students to do this exercise. It's an exercise in creating hunches, where I ask them to write down the anomaly, the puzzle, or surprise that you are studying. And then I ask them, okay, given that research question, problem, or puzzle, develop 4 different hunches for answering that problem. First, deal with it as it is done today. In other words, tell me what is the status quo baseline answer to this anomaly? How has the literature addressed that question thus far? Second, create a hunch by shifting between micro and macro levels. Go from, if the problem exists at the individual level, look at it from a macro organizational level. Vice versa. If you're talking about an organizational problem, look at it from the individuals within it. These are different categories for thinking about the problem. Third, alternate time periods. You think this puzzle exists today? What's it going to look like tomorrow? Or what did it look like yesterday? Does it unfold in cycles? It comes and goes through some kind of an entrainment process? But clearly, no puzzle, no surprise, no problem is static. It changes with time. Think about that. And finally, introduce a new concept. The puzzle is gone between action, individual action, and organization structure if you follow Giddens' new concept of structuration. So it dissolves the puzzle, because what you thought was a puzzle is in fact a spurious issue. So this is what I suggest. And what students come out with that experience is, wow, I thought I only had a surprise in one answer. Now you've given me 4 ways, 4 hunches to address my question. And that's the point. Using 4 very different categories. And these 4 categories happen to be 4 different strategies for dealing with paradox, as Scott Poole and I mentioned back in 1989. And once you've developed your hunch, such as dealing with as you do today, shifting levels, alternating time periods, introducing, and others, now start applying some criteria. Interestingness, plausibility, pragmatical, or others, but do so consistently across all of your hunches, so that then your evaluation criteria are going to be improved. So in conclusion, hunches and conjectures. I don't believe there would be any science at all without intuition. And that's what we're talking about in terms of coming up with hunches to deal with surprises. Anomalous thinking. Elf?
No, this is, I have little to add to that, but I think we should probably spend the last few minutes answering questions, because I see 4 hands that are up.
Good. Let's do so. Okay.
Andrew,
Yeah.
sorry. Can I ask you a question on the time aspect,
Yes.
the hunches around time? Because people doing processual research, particularly those who are doing it prospectively. Presumably they're being exposed to new developments in the phenomena, which is evolving and changing. So how does this idea of abductive reasoning come into play here, considering, that things themselves are changing over time?
Yes, indeed. Well, Andrew Abbott at the University of Chicago, many years, or 10 years ago, wrote a paper about process thinking. And he says, most process studies focus on three questions. The first question, what's the pattern, the process pattern? Is it A, B, 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 C? In other words, a stage-wise progression? Is it a cyclical ABC repetitive cycle? Or some other variation of the pattern? That's the central question in a process study. Over time, how do things unfold? Then the second and the third question focuses on, well, once you've identified a pattern, what caused it is the second question. And then the third question is, what are its consequences? So if you will, the second and the third questions are variance theory questions of alternative process progressions. So time is critical in any process study. You cannot do a process study without looking at time, because process looks at the sequence of events or patterns or activities that unfold in the emergence, the development, growth, termination, death of things. Okay.
Thank you.
Hunchen, is that correct? Thank you.
Yes, Professor. Thank you very much. This has been very enlightening for early career researchers like us. I saw a comment in the chat box, and I have a very similar question. How is this anomalous thinking different from problematization? And we come across both these things in research. That's my one question. Another question, maybe a more elementary question, is this anomaly at the level of context and the hunch at the level of theory? Did I get that right? Two questions. Thank you.
In the answer to the second, yes, I would say. And in answer to the first, problematizing certainly does include anomalizing, if you will. That is, the anomaly is the problem. It's the way you construct the problem. It's the formulation of the problem. And you formulate the problem up close and from afar in order to identify what is going on here. So in that sense, I think problematization is very much the process of identifying anomalies. And then the other one is certainly, like I said, yes, I do see that the issue of formulating the problem and developing the hunch. Alf, you want to add to that? Any comment?
No, I think that covers it very nicely.
Thank you.
I would just be repeating
Thank you so
what you
much.
said. And then...
Okay. Carl?
Here, it's good, but the wrong pronunciation does not bother me. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we do not have much time, so I try to be short. So first, can you talk a little bit about the paper development process itself? How long does it take to complete the draft? What was a review process at AMR? How much time? Secondly, I read the paper in March. I have completed a proposal for AMR dialogue. In case it is rejected, is it okay? I'll send you, I email you, we can have a conversation, etc. Thanks.
Yes, indeed. Alf, when did we start this paper? I'm trying to remember.
Well, it started, and I'm hard pressed to say when we started working on it together, because we had worked separately on abduction before that. But
yeah,
we probably started talking about it over dinners in maybe around 15, maybe 14, but 15, maybe as late as, no, I think 14 or 15, and then we started drafting things by 16.
I think that's right. Yep. Yeah, and I had a chapter, as you know, in the Engaged Scholarship book. The chapter on theory building is heavily, the first part of theory creation is all anomalies or hunches or abductions. So the answer, key, is a long time. But there's another point, which is I would say the average is 5-7 years to go from drafting a paper to the time of getting it published. And you're doing that, first of all, and the most important recommendation is draft a paper and share it with a sparring partner many times before you submit it to the judge and jury of a journal, the editor and reviewers. In fact, go ahead.
No, and on my part, I went back in March when this came out and see when did I start doing this, and I found notes in my drafts as old as 2004. So we both had been thinking about and tinkering with abduction, at least on my part, and he had been writing about it for many years. And then which is also how we connected over dinner, and how that process started. So it's kind of fussy when we started, because it depends on what you count as starting.
Yep.
And then the process in AMR, I think, is fairly uneventful. It's the classical. You get it back, and the normal time frame is 3 months. You get it back, and then you have 4 months to respond, and then you go through that cycle a few times. And so I think we submitted it in August of 19, which was the deadline for the special topic forum. And it came out in preprint in March 4th, 2021. So that's about a year and a half.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Katarina.
Yes, I have maybe one last question. So how basically to craft your argumentation for using abductive reasoning if you are writing a paper based on a single case study? Why I'm asking this, because some scholars kind of consider that if you write a paper based on a single case study and try to do process theorizing, they consider your paper kind of anecdotal, that what kind of process theorizing are you trying to do based on a single case study, but how to craft your argumentation if you really have collected rich data and you see some patterns in the theory, but both some discoveries in your data. So how would you, Professor, craft your arguments then to the reviewers?
My slide answers your question. It is the slide proposed by Stephen Toulmin, the British logician, who developed the basic structure of debate that is used in debate teams throughout America and Europe. He proposed the following template for developing your argument. There's a background, there's a problem, there's a question, there's a context in which it exists. Here is the anomaly as it exists, the background, which then provides the claim, which is your proposition. But it could be several propositions. Is it this or that? Or I propose this rather than the status quo. This is my claim of the argument. It is the theory, which then gets explained by reasons. Your major premise, the logic underlying the claim, supported with evidence, the minor premise, the warrants. Now, all reasons and evidence can be refuted on several grounds. The logic of the reasons may not be valid. The empirical refutation is that these data are not true. There's the cogency argument, which is the persuasiveness argument, pathos. and ethos in the rhetorical triangle, which then in turn leads you to qualify your claim by suggesting that my proposition or hypothesis hold under certain conditions, assumptions, and contingencies.
Mm-hmm.
I interpreted or heard your question as a inductive question about case studies. And there's a discussion in case studies about how many cases you do need. And I know that Kathy Eisenhardt has been sort of advocating that minimum of 4, but her student, or former student, I should say, Melissa Grebner, thinks 1 can be enough, and I suspect Melissa is right. If you look in classical cases of case studies, you can look at White's study of, which is, I guess, the most famous case study of all. White's study of street corner society. It's based on a single case. So yeah, you can do inductive or case studies based on 1 case. But I don't see it as necessarily an abductive process unless you enter some anomaly you need to explain, then abduction.
Yeah. I have another version here of how you might present your paper, your study. Again, beginning with an opening scene that attracts attention, pathos, then going to the anomaly. It's the problem, it's the issue. This is abduction. Because you got the problem up close and from afar, which leads you to diagnose what we know and don't know. This is where you are evaluating various hunches to come up with your question. Here's the status quo answer, the current answer to the theory, in practice and theory, to which you're going to find some gap. Here's another anomaly. Anomalies that exist, the limitations, the problems with the current status quo, which leads you to your proposal. I think this, and here's my argument for why I think this. And I conclude by arguing that my answer is better than the status quo, because. End of paper.
Great. Thank you very much.
This tree diagram provides a nice way of putting together the whole thing. So I have students go through exercises where they submit and present their research proposals using this tree diagram and putting it all on 1 paper, on 1 slide, no more, and then presenting it that way. And as you can see, I can talk through the entire project on 1 page. Okay. Adina, you had a question? You have your hand up and you're muted. Adina, Dabu?
Sorry, yes, I was muted.
Yes,
I was just curious about a little bit the backstage of your paper. How did it go through the review process? What did you learn in the review process about abduction while writing this paper and submitting it with NMR? If you want to share anything about this backstage, thank you.
Alf, what struck you? Because I recall initially we were thinking not just about theory creation in writing a paper for theory creation for the special issue, the Academy Management Review on theory creation. Instead, we were thinking more generatively in terms of creativity in theory and practice. Invention.
Originally, we started out with invention as our baseline because that's an interest we both share.
Mm-hmm.
But the review process, well, what struck me, and you have to comment on this because your experience with AMR is much broader than mine, but I was surprised at the level of engagement from the reviewers, and in particular the associate editor.
Yes,
they were deeply engaged in the paper, and I'm not saying that in the way that they were going easy. Far from it. they were very critical, but they were, there's no doubt about it, they were deeply engaged in it. And that was both very pleasing and terrifying at the same time.
But did they add much to your initial ideas?
The ideas were elaborated. They were expanded by suggesting further readings, by questioning, oh, well, this is just induction. And so we had one reviewer who, even to today, would still view what we've written as induction rather than abduction. And so there are some strongly held views that some reviewers have. Some are more close-minded, others are more open-minded. And that in turn is more frustrating, but it is to say the reviewer is never wrong in the sense that the reviewer is to be somehow a representative of the readership. And certainly we have to, and time and again, I think we probably worked more on that issue of finally putting to rest to say, here is our definitions of induction, deduction, and abduction, and others have different points of view, but we'll leave it at that because we want to talk about the steps, the sequence of abduction. The other thing that I learned is initially we had the basic steps, but we didn't have the further advice within each step. As you formulate the anomaly, do so up close and from afar. As you look at hunches, never settle for one, look for many.
Right.
As you are going from individual to group, you're going from evolution to dialectical inquiry. Those are important moves that emerged as we were developing the revisions. What do you think, Alf?
No, they forced us to sharpen and defend our arguments and clarify things that we thought were clear, but that obviously were not. And one thing, a specific thing that comes to mind is this notion that we were talking about the prepared mind and the importance of deep expertise and all this. And one of the reviewers pointed out that, well, that contradicts with cognitive flexibility, because when you become deeply expert in something, you're less likely to be cognitive flexible and can jump. So we had to resolve that issue.
Thank you so much. Very
okay, Lida.
Thank you. I think we live in a world that is full of surprises and anomalies. I would like to hear your view on how to assess the importance of anomaly. So when you identify something that you cannot explain, in a way, this also related to our earlier question, I think, or really ask if this is just, if this surprise is just, or this phenomenon, strange phenomenon, it occurs only among, it's just outliers among a few, a smaller portion of the population.
Right.
Why does it matter? That's my question.
Right. I think we should not be not confuse the importance of the anomaly with the importance of the explanation. Think back to the example we used. Andy, if you want to go back to the Amy slide 8. If you think about what she discovered was that some medical teams, the more successful medical teams reported more errors. In the grand scheme of things, at some hospital, I don't know where it was, but since Amy is in Boston, let's say it's a hospital in Boston. In the grand scheme of things, that's not an important thing that's going to change the world. But her explanation of the phenomenon did make a huge impact. Psychological safety has been tremendously impactful. The anomaly in itself, not so much, but it was important in the grand scheme of things anyway.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And then Alston, I'm being conscious of time.
Right.
It's been 2 hours now. Maybe perhaps this could be a good time to close the conversation as well. What do you think?
I think so, huh? So the conclusion I have is these concluding prescriptions for abductive theory creation. And I think our hypothesis is the more you take explicit account of these steps and think about the bullets below these steps, the more creative your theory will be. That's the hypothesis. I'd love to test that now that we have developed this hunch. Well, actually, we've gone a bit further because through the review process, I guess we're no longer at the abductive stage. We are at the theory construction stage. As a result of the sparring and the criticisms of the reviewers that leads you down the path of forcing you to develop a theory for your hunch that theory creation is not just a flash of inspiration. Instead, it consists of a systematic set of moves that is not only individual, but collective. Alf, your concluding comment?
No, I just want to thank everyone for their great questions. This made me think about some things in a new way and think about things that I haven't. And for that, I am grateful. I would also appreciate it if someone could save and send us the questions in the chat, because they rolled by far too quick for me to see them all. But I see there's stuff here that I'd like to read afterwards.